You have to stop and think or do some research to find out what would be the most natural way to say that in the other language.
The natural way. I think that's
And
the key word.
that's the key word because as a translator, you're trying to create something that doesn't sound like it's been translated, doesn't read like it's been translated. Your goal is to get something that looks like it was a document that was written in originally in the language that you're translating into.
Hello, and welcome again to the Pathways podcast, where we explore different careers in the Quebec City region. I'm your host, Susanna Tang, from Voice of English-Speaking Quebec. Today, I'll be speaking with Jonathan Keathley about his experience working as a translator. Jonathan has over 35 years of experience and is currently a freelancer. He also spent several years working in government ministries. Okay, listeners, as usual, we're beginning at the start of Jonathan's career, which you'll hear is closely tied to how Jonathan came to live in Quebec City.
From the United States originally, but I've lived in Quebec City for the past over 40 years. And how I got here, well, as a graduate student at a university in the United States, it was a doctoral program in French with an emphasis more on linguistics than on literature. And this opportunity came up because the university there had an exchange program with Laval University here. I went on that exchange thinking I would just be here for a year. And like within 2 weeks, I met my husband, whom we're still together like 41 years later, and fell in love with him, but fell in love with Quebec at the same time. You know, I had a student visa. To stay here, I had to come up with something to do, and I would have to work. So looked around and thought about it, enrolled in the master's program in translation at Laval University. And that enabled me to renew my student visa from year to year to year until I could actually apply to become a permanent resident. So that's how, stumbled into it, sort of.
Moving along, I asked Jonathan to share more about his different work experiences.
The first place I worked in the government was in the Department of Justice at the Regulations Office. They were in charge of translating all regulations from French to English. Then after 10 years there, I went to Revenue, what it was the Department of Ministère du Revenu at the time, but it's now called Revenu Québec. And that's where I did most of my time as a civil servant in the Quebec Civil Service. Until about 10 years ago, it was a good job. It was a very good job. I enjoyed it, but it had been the same thing for a long time. So I decided to try my hand as a freelancer, and that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years.
So when you say you do a translation, how does that work?
Okay. Well, in most cases, translators work in teams. In most of the situations that I've been in, mostly in government, and in most cases, you're a part of a team of translators. And generally, everyone in the team is a translator, but also there are some of the members of the team that may be more experienced and more advanced as translators, and they serve as revisers. So everything that you translate, once you've done a best job you can, it goes off to the reviser who goes over it to catch errors, because everybody can make errors, and also probably to improve the style and just to help. One thing that I remember as far as about being revised, you sort of have to have a sense of humility and be ready to accept criticism. When I was just starting out, I was still learning. I remember when I was at the regulations office in the Department of Justice, one of the first translations I did, I got a regulation to translate, and it had the expression to do something, to accomplish something, or selon les règles de l'art. And it just turned out that the regulation had something to do with art objects. So I just translated it according to the rules of art. Well, it came back to me from the reviser, and the reviser was very kind about it, but explained to me that it's a stock expression, selon les règles de l'art. It even has a definition in law, and it means according to standard professional practice. It had nothing to do with art. I was, a little bit shamefaced after.
But it's a really good lesson, exactly, that translation is not literal. It's not word for word.
And you have to, translation is not word for word. You learn by making mistakes. The thing is, and this is something I really think I should emphasize, is that you have to know enough to know when you don't know. You have to know enough about French and English to know when you don't know. Working as a translator, you never stop learning.
That's worth noting. Learning is continuous, and every domain has its own language. Speaking of learning, we tackle the question about training next.
First of all, it's not enough to grow up being bilingual. In fact, I might even say that in some cases, being bilingual is perhaps an impediment to becoming a good translator. To be really a good translator, just knowing that you're speaking French and speaking English is not enough. You have to develop certain skills. for conveying one message in what's called your source language. The language that you're translating from, you call it the source language. The language you're translating into is called your target language. And your source language will be the one, usually be the one that you learned in school, whereas your target language should be your native language, because that's the language you feel most at ease in. So some people can just set themselves up as a translator. It's very rare that you can do that without having some kind of training. Anyone who's has a background in languages, linguistics, or even literature, it's sort of the prerequisite that you have, plus a little bit of training, some training, actual training that you can sort of get in doing a bac or a maîtrise in translation.
In addition, Jonathan notes that translators in Quebec should join and become certified by the profession's order.
Ordre des traducteurs, terminologues et interprètes agréés du Québec.
Next, we talk about technology and how that impacts his work.
We do use a lot of information technology in translation. There are computer-assisted translation where the computer will do a lot of the work for you. These programs work by, they have a corpus of translations that are already existing and that are just fed into the computer, and the computer chews them up, mashes them out, and it gets spit out parts at you again. So, you can just dump your text into the computer. It'll translate it, comparing it with what it has in its database. And so it'll come up with a sort of a translation, but you have to go through it and fix it. You understand what I mean? It's time. I started out translating. It was still in the age when we were transitioning from typewriters to the old clunky word processing programs, okay? Which machines that did nothing but word processing, which were really slow and clunky. And so I've seen it improve a whole lot since then. There's computer-assisted translation, and there are also all the online tools that'll help you, like for doing research. And that's another aspect of the whole thing. You have to know how to research stuff. When you're translating, you're never going to know what's going to be thrown at you. I mean, you may specialize. Because of what I've done over my years, I've got to become familiar with legal language. I've done a lot of translating of court judgments. And so I've become familiar with that language. But they can hit you with something new. Just as an example, the very last translation that I did, it was about circus artists. And it was a regulation for the Quebec government, but it was a regulation opening up people who are in training as circus artists so that they would be covered by Quebec's health and occupational safety regulations. And most of it was pretty dry stuff, the kind of the stuff that I'm used to translating all the time. But then it got into what are the different categories of circus artists and what do they do? And then there are things that I've never heard of before. So I had to find out, a gré, a longe. These are different categories of people that work as circus artists. I had to find out what do these people do and how do you say it in English. And some of it was obvious, like a trapéziste is a trapeze artist, a jongleur is a juggler, a gaillard is a rigger, person who sets up the cables and the tightrope wire and so forth. And the longeur took a lot of research online to find out what that is. But the longeur is the person who holds the cable for a trapeze artist, the safety cable. It took a lot of work to find out what it was, and I actually had to call the circus organization. There's a circus organization in Quebec called En Piste, which is like an umbrella organization for all schools that train circus artists, and I had to call them finally for help to find out what exactly longeur was and how to say it in English. That's one of the fun parts about it. You learn a lot of different subjects when you're working as a translator.
Learning new things is just one of the reasons Jonathan loves his job. Here's a few more.
Because it allows me to work with language, which is what I've always wanted to do since I was a kid. And it's a lot of problem solving. It really forces you to use your mental power, and it keeps you sharp. And also, I generally, I like the people that I work with. I think translators are, most of them have a story, and they're interesting people. So I like working in a team with other translators. And even though I'm working as a freelancer now, I'm still in contact with the other translators. And if I need help or if I want to bounce an idea off someone, I can call on people. So.
Very nice. What is difficult about your job?
Source texts that are badly written. That's the worst thing. Sometimes trying to figure out what the person was even trying to say is a bummer. It's really tough. And then having to try to negotiate that with someone who may not realize that source text is not really all it should be. That's difficult.
Are we ready to talk about, you might have hinted at it already, but let's go right into it. What are the top 3 skills a translator should have?
Yeah, I've tried to think about that a bit, and it's hard to get it down to 3, but meticulous and attention to detail. You have to be the kind of person who you can go over things again and again, see where the problems are, and make sure that you correct your mistakes. I mean, mistakes can slip through in any case, but you have to be very meticulous to detail. I have to have a thorough knowledge of the source language that you're working from, in my case, French. And I think you have to have excellent writing skills in the target language.
Thorough knowledge of the source language and the good writing skills. How
Mhm.
can you develop those?
By reading a lot. Yeah, I think that's another thing you need to sort of keep up on. Don't spend all evening watching Netflix. Read something. You need to be aware of language. As you need more than just listening to the evening news. You sort of need to read, keep aware of current events, know what's going on. Very useful just to read classic literature in your source language and your target language. You have to be sensitive to language and always developing your language skills and always extending your language. I learn new things about English or French. I wouldn't say every day, but all the time. So one way you can do that is read, and don't just skip over the words that you don't understand. Look them up in the dictionary to expand your understanding of the language. I mean, you're not going to be a literary translator, but at least it extends breadth of knowledge in the language, both on the English side and on the French side, if you just read a lot. Either contemporary, read The Economist, or read the Globe and Mail, or on the other side, read the Le Devoir or French news magazines, or just read.
Students, are you interested in being self-employed? Listen up as Jonathan talks about the pros and cons of being a freelancer.
Yeah, as far as being a freelancer or not being if you're working as a job for a company or for the government, of course you've got a salary. But if you're working as a freelancer, you're usually paid sometimes by the hour, but usually by the word. The way that works is you get your source text and you can just it's in Word, in Microsoft Word. You can count the number of words. The machine will count the words for you, and you charge a rate for the words. I mean, it ranges from like 20 to 30 cents, I think. The most I've ever gotten paid for a translation was 32 cents, but they were really desperate for it. And that's how it works. If you're a freelancer, you're sort of on your own. Very often you may be in a situation where, you don't have a revisor, so you're not getting any feedback. That's one of the disadvantages. But if you've already developed your skills to the point where you can perhaps skip the revision step in your work, there's no problem with working as a freelancer, but I always feel that it's an advantage to have someone who can revise your work. Even as a freelancer, depending on who you're working for, you may, have someone who will revise your work and then give you feedback on it. But many times the freelancer will, the revision step is simply eliminated because you don't have team members who can take a look at your work for you. But the advantage is work when you want. You can work till midnight, sleep till noon the next day. You still have deadlines, but your time is much more flexible. Well, everyone now has discovered how much they enjoy working at home. So I think that's probably the wave of the future. I know that at Revenue Quebec, I've stayed in touch with people at Revenue Quebec, and they're all working from home now, and they may never go back. It seems to be working very, very well for them, working as a team, everybody working at home. And so the pandemic may have shown us that actual physical offices are a thing of the past, not for everything, but for a lot of professions.
Final question. What advice do you have for high school students?
Well, I'd say for them, if you're interested, if you think this is something you might want to do as a career, find someone who is a translator and talk to him or her. If you know someone, or if you know someone who knows someone who is a translator, ask them about their own experiences and what they like about the job. It might interest you. Who knew that I would wind up a translator in Quebec when all I wanted to do was study French?
And that's all for this episode. Thank you again to our guest, Jonathan Keathley, for sharing his advice and insights. We would also like to acknowledge the Government of Canada for funding this initiative. Listeners, we wish you the best as you embark on your own career journey. This is the Pathways Podcast. Thanks for listening.